Nirupam Sahay has an impressive career spanning over a quarter century in sales, marketing, general management, and P&L management. Till recently, he was heading Philips Lighting's consumer lamps globally, and before that was CEO Philips Lighting for the Indian Subcontinent. Nirupam brings with him a deep understanding of diverse Indian, Asian, and global markets and consumers. Prior to Philips, he held key positions in marquee companies such as GE Capital, Whirlpool, and Asian Paints. Nirupam is a graduate of St. Stephen's, Delhi, an MBA from Narsee Monjee, and holds an advanced management program from Wharton. Welcome, Nirupam.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So today we are talking about something very interesting, which is about mentoring. So maybe you can start by telling us what got you interested, what you say you're passionate about mentoring. So what's the genesis of that?
So I think it's a result of fairly early in my career and definitely midway through my career, having some great mentors myself. So since I was a mentee and I had formal and informal mentors in my career, I found great value in that. So I think it helped me develop as a professional. I think it helped me develop as a person. So I saw great value in that, and I was ready to pay it forward. So in my career, particularly in the last 15 odd years in GE Capital and in Philips Lighting, I kind of made sure that whenever there was an opportunity, whether formally or informally, wherever there's an opportunity to be a mentor myself, then I did that. So I continued to be a mentee on and off, but I definitely remained a mentor for large parts of that 15-year period. And I think that entire process of both learning and absorbing as a mentee and trying to help others develop as a mentor, I think I really enjoyed it from both angles, as a mentee and as a mentor. And that's why, that's something that I've been passionate about for some time. I think and I hope I've added some value over the years. But in the process, I've also learned. So you end up as a mentor also learning from your mentee. And I think that's a great equation. So it's not one way. I think at the end of the day, you're learning a lot from all the mentees who come from different parts of the organization or from other organizations. And there's a lot to learn, I think, for the mentor as well. So as long as you have that attitude of learning from others, I think that's a great way to go. So you're both giving and absorbing and getting something back in return as well.
Great. So, you talked of the attitude, and we'll talk a lot about that because I personally think it's a lot to do with the attitude from both sides, a lot to do with the commitment also from both sides, because, in my experience, I've seen a lot of companies trying to, having formal programs, but it's not necessarily that they worked so well. And I think that had a lot to do with the attitude and maybe commitment levels. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? How do you make it work?
So I think it's very critical that there is a high commitment level from both the mentor and mentee. It doesn't work otherwise. So unless the mentor is willing to commit to time, commit to really developing someone else, and the mentee doesn't have that attitude of wanting to talk about things they need to focus on and be willing to learn from the mentor, unless that level of commitment is there right from the get-go, somewhere along the line it'll fall apart. So I think it's very, very critical that right at the beginning of this relationship, whether it's a formal process or it's an informal process, either way, the mentor and mentee need to have that chat that both are committed to. It's almost like a work relationship. And both of them have to spend that time and effort to make that relationship work. And unless you have that kind of commitment level, the very high chances. I think both you and I in our careers have seen cases where the mentor-mentee relationship, you thought it would be great, but it just didn't work. And I can pretty much bet that in about 70-80% of those cases, it would be because the commitment levels, either of the mentor and mentee, were not high enough. So I think that's a starting point.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. And sometimes, it may start with a high level of commitment, but commitment can also wane where either party is not seeing the value or it's not working. Maybe sometimes it's just it's not happening the way it's supposed to happen. So a lot of the things even can fall through the cracks. So maybe we'll also talk about some of those do's and don'ts. The
Sure.
other thing you mentioned was the informal versus formal mentoring. So in your mind, how do you differentiate those two?
So there are a lot of organizations which put a formal mentoring program in place.
Mm-hmm.
So what they will do is they'll take some of the senior leaders in the senior leadership team and maybe one level below and say that we'd like you to be mentors for what are called high potential, top potential in different companies, but people who you want to invest in as a company. And you say that we want you to be a mentor for 1, 2, or 3 mentees. And then you'll identify some people who are likely to become the mentees. Now, that then becomes a bit of a formal process. So you have a formal appointment of a mentor and his or her mentees. And then very often there's a process put in place saying that, you need to meet at a certain frequency. We'd like you to kind of keep track of how it's going, maybe jot down the discussion, etc., and make it a little more formal. And I think that has great value. I think it's a good way of doing it or formalizing it. But I think equally important is even if your company does not have a formal mentoring process, that's no reason not to go out and get a good mentor for yourself. So in those cases, that's what I call informal mentoring. So you say, I'm midway through my career to reach the next level. I want to become a business head, a functional head, etc. I think that this person in the organization, or it could even be outside the organization, would be a great mentor for me. And then even though HR is not involved and it's not a formal process within the company, you can still go to that person and say, I'd like you to be a mentor for the following reasons. And then it's up to that person to say, yes, I'd love to do that. Now, I think the value of an informal mentor versus a formal mentor, I don't see a difference.
Okay.
The kind of relationship that needs to be there, the kind of commitment level that needs to be there, it remains exactly the same. The only difference is a formal process versus an informal process. But an informal process does not mean that it's suboptimal or not good enough. So I think it's very often up to mentees to make sure they become part of either the formal process that exists in the company, but if it doesn't exist, that's no excuse. So if you find value in it, then go out and find a good mentor. So you could maybe ask your manager to find someone for you, or if you identified someone yourself, then you can just approach the person directly, and both routes can work equally well. So I think it's important that we see the value in both formal and informal mentoring. I don't think one is better than the other. Both of them add a lot of value.
One of the things that's coming to my mind is, and linking back to the commitment level, if somebody is going for an informal mentoring, obviously there is higher commitment level because he or she wants to get, mentored. Whereas sometimes if a company is asking somebody to go and get mentored, it might be also taken in a slightly different way, saying that, hey, you know what, maybe that's a signaling that the company is doing. So can it also be like a company sets in place a process and then, it's up to the people to go and decide whether they want mentoring in the first place, so which in my mind is kind of somewhere in between. Do you think something like that could also work?
I think all the models work. So I've seen different models in different organizations. So one is where, the CEO and CHRO will sit together and decide these are the senior leadership guys who would make good mentors, and these are the people who who we want as mentees. And then you appoint people. So that becomes kind of a process where the mentor and mentee come in at a later stage and they're told, we'd like you to be a mentor, I'd like you to be a mentee.
Yeah.
The other is where there's a process in place, and then you raise your hand and say, I would like to be a mentor, or I would like to be a mentee. And I agree with you. I think that's also a pretty nice way, because then it shows that initial commitment level, because you've raised your hand and said, I would like that process to happen. So I think both can work equally well. Okay. And I've seen them work in slightly different ways in different organizations. So I think both have value.
You talk to CXO level. So what is a good level for a mentor-mentee relationship? So if I am a middle manager, is it the right time for me to get a mentor? Or do I need to be really at the top level to start looking at mentoring?
That's a very good point. And I think if you and I look back on our careers, I think if we had mentors early in career and midway through careers, that might have helped a lot. So what happens generally is that only when you hit mid to senior management is when people start saying, okay, let's appoint a mentor for this person.
Mm.
And actually, there's a lot of value early in career because that's when you're really getting molded and shaped and you can learn and absorb even more. So I think that's an underdeveloped part of mentoring, which is having mentoring for people who are young in career or midway through career versus people who have already reached 15, 20 years of experience. So I think finding a process where you can have mentors even for people who are 5-10 years into their jobs versus treating it as something which is only for mid to senior management. I think that's one mindset change that companies probably need to go in for. That mentoring can happen at any stage of your career. It doesn't have to be only at a later stage. So I think that is important. And you and I were discussing, I think informally earlier, that maybe if we had mentors very early in our career formally, that might have really helped us even more. So we valued the mentors we've had in our lives in the later stages, but if we had them earlier, that might have added even more. So I think it's not stage in career, it's really your willingness to learn, your openness to spending time with a mentor and really conveying what you want to develop. So which part of the professional life is it that you want the mentor to help you to become better at? So that it doesn't become a generic discussion, but more focused on how you can develop as a professional and as a person. I think that's an important thing to do as well. I think it's equally important in all of this that I think if a mentor or mentee believes that they don't want to go in for this process, so if a company says you're a mentor and you say, I'm a successful professional, but I don't think I can be a good mentor. And there are different personalities. So someone who doesn't want to spend time with another individual is not so interested in developing others. That's fine. So if a mentor is mature enough to say that, I don't think I'll be a good mentor, why don't you find someone else? Then the company should say, that's fine. You should force someone to be a mentor. It's something that needs to come from inside. And similarly for a mentee, if a mentee should have, again, the guts and the maturity to say that that's the wrong mentor for me. I don't think that's the right person. If you're thinking of a mentor, then why don't you think of the other person? So I think it's absolutely okay for either a mentor or mentee to either right at the beginning. I think ideally right at the beginning, you should establish whether you want to be a mentor or you want to be a mentee, and whether you need to be a mentor or want to be a mentor-mentee together. And it's okay to say no at any stage. You talked earlier about some of the relationships not working and not being successful. I think part of it is the fact that, sometimes you say a great coach will naturally become a great mentor, and that's not a natural progression. And you could be a great coach, you may not be a great mentor. And as a mentee, you may not relate to a certain kind of leader, and you'll relate much better to a different kind of leader. So I think it's absolutely okay to then experiment a little and even say no right at the beginning or halfway through the relationship and say, it's not working, and move on to a better mentor-mentee relationship. So you should not get sucked into saying that now I'm in a mentor-mentee relationship, I need to make it work come hell or high water. Mm. That's not true. If it's not working, it's better to pull the plug and try another one rather than keep hammering at something which in a couple of meetings you can generally make out whether, as a mentor, for example, I could make out very clearly whether the mentee was interested in continuing or not. And I'm sure the mentee was also equally assessing whether this was the right mentor for him or her. So I think that is something also that you need to focus on. Is it the right kind of mentor-mentee relationship or not? And if it's not, it's better to stop rather than keep hammering at it.
That's a great point which you're bringing, because And I'm just processing, a lot of the things you said. This is very interesting. So I heard you talking about mindsets. I think that's very important. You were asking about my career. Yes, when I look back, I now wish I had a mentor, 10 year, 15, even 20 years back. Now, why I didn't have, I don't know, maybe it was those days, it was just, the concept was not there. I wish I had. Let's talk a little bit about the mindset. You made a very good point saying that, it's about commitment, and it's about having a genuine, almost you need to care about that relationship, right? It cannot happen otherwise, and which is why probably not everybody can be a good mentor. So talk to us about the right kind of attitude which is required from both sides of how to make it work.
So there's an organizational psychologist called Adam Grant who teaches at Wharton, and he's written a lovely book called Givers and Takers, and I think he puts it very well. So I think fundamentally, a good mentor needs to basically be a giver.
Okay.
So be willing to share their experience, be willing to give up some of the secrets that have led to them being successful, and not look at it as something that will help them in their career, but something that will help the mentee in their career.
Okay.
And that's an attitude that not everyone has.
Right.
So I think fundamentally you need to find people who have the attitude of wanting to help others, of wanting to see others develop and do well. And if you can find people like that, then they will give their heart and soul to the mentoring process. So I think it's kind of important for, I think, the company to find people like that. And I think for people to self-analyze and say whether they want to become a mentor. Going back to that point, it's good to self-analyze and say, I think I'll be a good mentor, I won't be a good mentor. And if you're not going to be a good mentor, don't waste time, because you'll end up wasting your time and the mentee's time. And you'll find out 4 months later that it's not working. So it's better to just say that, no, that's not something that I enjoy doing. It's not something that I believe in very strongly. Then that's fine. So I think that attitude of being a bit of a giver, of wanting others to be successful, if you can start with that mindset, then you will approach it in a way where you're trying to add value all the time. And you're not seeing it as a chore or something that is a tick mark that you need to deliver on. It's genuinely wanting to spend time, understand the other person, and help them on their career journey. So that's where I think that mindset and attitude become extremely critical, particularly as a mentor. And if you look at the mentee, then you have to have that attitude of wanting to learn, of being open to listening to potential, either criticism or ways to do things better. So I think that mindset of a little bit of continuous learning for both the mentor and mentee. But I think the mentors in that whole process also end up learning a lot from the mentee. So again, as a mentor, I've had mentees from different parts of the organization, from different functions, different geographies. And it's so interesting because in that process of mentoring, I think I've learned a lot. So you get to see the company from a different lens, from a different perspective. So it could be functional expertise, which you may not have as much of in terms of functional expertise. So you learn in terms of functional expertise, you see how that person views what the senior leadership is doing on the strategy of the company. So in that entire process, I think you also have a little bit of learning for the mentor as well. So the mentor again needs to be open to learning from a mentee. And that brings me to another thing, which is reverse mentoring.
Okay.
And I think reverse mentoring is also something which I have personally seen being very successful. So in Phillips Lighting, for example, we had a process of reverse mentoring, particularly on things like what is the youth of India focusing on? How are they using social media? So you would have someone in their 40s with a reverse mentor who was maybe in their 20s or early 30s. So much younger, different generation, different ways of using social media, different ways of understanding the consumer. And you deliberately had these reverse mentors. So you would actually have a process where that 25-year-old is telling the 40-year-old what's happening in the industry, what's happening with the youth, what's happening with consumers, how can you use social media better. So, for example, I started using Twitter for the first time after being reverse mentored by someone. So till then, I was not using it. I didn't feel any need to use it. But then he explained how it was being used by people, how it could add value. And suddenly, I got onto Twitter. So I think reverse mentoring, again, has a lot of value if, again, you're very clear what you want the reverse mentoring to achieve. In this case, it was focusing on understanding the youth and younger consumers and social media. It could be something else in another organization. But I think that's an interesting thing. So mentoring does not always have to be from senior to junior. It can also be the other way around, depending on what you want to focus on.
Very interesting, this reverse mentoring thing, because mentoring, when we hear, sounds like there is a mentor who's at a higher level than the mentee, essentially, right? Giving guidance and all of that. So here the tables are turned. It's the other way around. And I think the attitude will become even more important, isn't it? I mean, if
absolutely.
if I have to get mentored by somebody who's half my age, I need to have the humility, the vulnerability, the attitude. I need to understand why it's important to learn. I think it requires a lot more attitudinal change from leaders. Wouldn't you agree?
I absolutely agree. But I remember reading, so even people like Indra Nooyi, so as a CEO of PepsiCo for years and years, I remember reading about her talking about reverse mentoring and getting mentored by someone who was in their 20s and finding a lot of value in it. So I think it goes back to leaders, like you said, who have humility, who are willing to show vulnerability or willing to learn.
Yes.
And say that it's not that they know everything. Clearly, no executive and no professional knows everything out there. And there's a lot of value in finding people who can help you to be more successful in understanding what's happening in the outside world. So I think that was an interesting process as well. So it's not always from an older to younger. It can be from younger to older. And there's lots to learn both ways.
So one thing that's emerging clearly in this conversation is, of course, it's a process, then the system, but it's probably a lot more to do with the mindset, which could sound simple, but actually incredibly hard, right? Even the givers and takers, I love that analogy. I mean, how many people, we often tend to approach something thinking, what's in it for me, right? That's the first thing that comes to our mind. Whereas here you're saying it's all about starting with the giving mindset, right? But at the same time, when you start doing it, you're saying you learn a lot in the process, which is
absolutely. So that willingness to both give and take, not in the sense of taking away from the other person, but absorbing and learning.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some do's and don'ts, which will make the process more effective. One could be the frequency itself. Often it doesn't happen on time, and then people lose interest. So what's your advice there?
I think there is definitely a time commitment that is required. And I found the best way to do it is to formalize it. So block it in your calendar. So the mentor and mentee have a 1 hour slot. Whether that's once in 2 weeks, whether that's once in 4 weeks, that's dependent on them. But they do need to meet frequently. So I don't believe in mentoring relationships where you meet once in 6 months. Okay. So sometimes you'll have a tick in the box that I met once in 6 months and I met once in 6 months. But I think fundamentally, for a mentor to understand what is in the mind of the mentee, what are the things to focus on, what should they be spending time on in the future meetings, I think it's very important for them to set that by meeting together, and you need to meet fairly frequently. And I think they need to formalize it and put it in their calendars and then block it off. And I think it's very important that when that is happening, so what I would do, for example, when I had a mentor-mentee discussion, I put it in my calendar, and then for that 1 hour, I would be just completely focused on that discussion. But I think you owe it to the mentee. So rather than looking at emails and looking at your buzzing phone, so I would tell my secretary that no one comes into the room, switch off all devices, and just focus on the discussion. And that also shows, I think, mutual respect. So you want to focus on the discussion, really get in depth. You can't get in depth if you meet once in 6 months. So you really need to spend time together. And I found that formalizing it and setting it in the calendar and blocking it off rather than doing it on the fly, I think that works much better. Because otherwise it kind of keeps getting pushed. So if you say, okay, we're meeting now, let's meet now in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks and put it in the calendar so that both people then manage their lives around that. So I think formalizing the process, meeting frequently are things that I would really recommend. The other is, I think it's pretty important to keep track of the discussions. Okay. So both the mentor and mentee, I would advise, should take some kind of notes. And they don't have to be extensive notes, but definitely what were the discussions around? What were the things that were focused on? If there's something the mentor, for example, has promised to get back or the mentee has promised to get back on, then at least, both of you keep track of it. So just capturing the essence of the discussion so that you can go back to it later. So even when the mentor-mentee relationship might end after a year and a half, but you can always go back to your notes on what was discussed and what you found value in. Again, both as a mentor and mentee. So I think just keeping track of it rather than treating it as completely informal and we've had a discussion and that's the end of it. It's for yourself. So it's not to share with the company, it's not to share with HR, etc., but it's just to make sure that every discussion moves you forward in the journey. So I found that is something that works pretty well. And like I said, I think make sure the point we started with, make sure that there's equal commitment both sides. At any stage, if you see wavering in the commitment, then actually put a full stop and pull the plug and move on rather than wasting time. So I think some of these things would be useful in any mentor-mentee relationship.
Yeah, those are some great points. And again, I hear a lot of mindset related things more than the tactical stuff, right?
Absolutely.
You made a brilliant point about respect because today everybody has a lot more to do, and especially if you're mentoring with somebody very senior, they have so much to do, and to be able to kind of not just be physically present in terms of blocking a time and a calendar, but also to be emotionally and mentally present, right? And not live in their heads, right? Which is often what we end up doing. I think that's hard to do, right? But what you're saying is that that's absolutely critical to the process.
True.
Super. No, that's been really amazing, hearing from you with all your experience. Is there one thing that you'd like to leave the audience with, Anupam? Nirupam?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I would leave it with two things. One, if you want to be a mentee, don't wait for the world to come to you, go out and find a good mentor. So whether it's early in your career, so people who are early or mid in their career who are watching this, don't wait for a formal process to happen. If you believe that it's going to add value to you, then go out and seek a good mentor. And I think as a mentor, I would say that if you have that attitude of wanting to help develop others, if you want to give back, then I think mentoring is a great way to leverage all your knowledge and experience and help others to develop. So I would strongly recommend it. If you have that kind of mindset and attitude, then I would highly recommend that you, again, whether it's a formal process or not, go out and find mentees that you will then help to develop. And there's nothing more satisfying than seeing either people in your team or your mentees doing well in life. And that gives you a huge feeling of satisfaction because you've helped in some small way in helping them develop as a professional and as a person. And I think that's all you can do. Give back as much as you can.
Excellent. That was amazing. And I'm sure our audience can benefit a lot. And for people out there, I'm sure they'll be wanting to now go out and get a mentor or be a mentor themselves. Yeah, be a mentor themselves. Thank you so much, Nirupam, for that excellent, engaging conversation. Okay, thank you so much.
I loved it. Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.